Before I introduce the next speaker, I'd like to just reiterate one of the words. We're all troublemakers here today, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to deal with this. But it is true that at a forum such as this, and I've been proud to be part of this, for lack of a better word, movement for the last 7.5 years. And bringing communities together in small forums such as this one, and then building upon it. I don't want anyone to leave here today saying, I don't understand, or what could we do next? Because if that's the question, we will remain here so you can talk to us about it. There is something for everyone here to do, no matter how small it is or how big it is, baby steps or leaps and bounds, and we can all put an end to this problem together. I'd like to just take a moment and say Rabbi Yosef Blau, as I mentioned earlier, has really been on the forefront of this from the rabbinical leadership role in not only bringing this issue to public awareness, public forums, and a lot of times taking lines and making statements that have gotten him into hot water, but really putting his money where his mouth is. Attending seders for victims of abuse and their families, leading groups and marches, helping with protests, helping with support, helping counsel the families of how to do it, how to go through this terrible process. And it's been an honor and a privilege for me personally to be able to work with Rabbi Blau on so many unfortunate matters, and know that there's someone there who really wants to give his all and really help. Rabbi Blau?
It's a real privilege for me to participate in this panel, and I'm going to be dealing with a different but critical component in trying to reduce the scourge in the Jewish community, knowing fully well that it's a worldwide problem, not a specifically Jewish one, not a specifically Orthodox one, but each community has its own particular ways of confronting problems, and some of the approaches that we have used in the past tragically have made the problem worse rather than better in our own community. So I'm going to deal with certain terms that are thrown about. A little correction of pronunciation, the term is Mesira. It's a very important term to deal with because it reverberates throughout Jewish history. The Jews living in exile for close to 2,000 years often faced hostile environments, anti-Semitic governments, and we were terribly concerned about Jewish informers, who in many cases were simply traitors to their people for personal benefit. And halakha, Jewish law, treats them very severely. So it remains a term that once used causes people to react strongly. It's a taboo. All you have to do is call someone a moser, someone he's now a traitor, he's out of the picture completely. There are numerous reasons why that term is irrelevant to the situation we're dealing with here. But to start with the fact that many of the halachic authorities deny that Mesira exists at all if the Jews are living in a society that is democratic, that has fair laws and equal treatment of all its citizens. The Aruch HaShulchan is one of those famous ones. So according to that view, which I happen to think should be applied, there's nothing to talk about. But let's accept those who say no, it applies everywhere. We can go back to Maimonides, where Maimonides writes, if there's an individual who is harming the community one is obligated to send them to the secular authorities to be punished, and he uses the word ser, which means to put them in prison, to deal with another claim that's irrelevant. Abusers don't stop. They are a threat to the children that they've abused, whom they continue to hurt, and to many others. They form that category. The Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch says that if someone is a danger to the community, we cannot solve that individual by ourselves, then we must turn to the outside world, to the secular authorities. In specifically referring to abuse of children, there's a long list of rabbinic authorities, current authorities, from the Hasidic world, from the Misnagdish world, all of whom say that if one is aware of someone abusing children, one must go to secular authorities. So why is it that the question still exists? So they look for loopholes. In one famous responsum, a great authority said that if there's not even, what he used the words, raglayim ledavar, meaning there's no circumstantial evidence, there's just a vague suspicion, then one should not go to the police who may be punishing an innocent person. And that got interpreted that you have to get approval of a rabbi. It's a misinterpretation, and it's absurd. We know the concept of experts according to Jewish law. The Mishnah says that if there's a question on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, whether a person is so sick that he has to eat, you go and you ask the doctors. You don't ask the rabbis. Why? Because that is a question that requires a certain kind of expertise. A doctor knows and can evaluate illness. Rabbis are not trained in that. Well, who are the experts in determining whether an accusation of abuse has some validity? Is it his rabbis who are not trained? It's health professionals, it's police, it's all the people who've been trained to make that judgment. Frankly, I shouldn't even have to go that far. When a child reports abuse, that child knows it's true. No one questions that that child, if old enough, shouldn't pick up the phone and call the police. Because it's not a question of maybe the child experienced abuse. I trust that most of us know our children. If our children come home and tell us that they've been touched inappropriately, we should know well enough to trust our own children and not have any doubts and hesitations. And if someone has that doubt, unfortunately, then that person should immediately take the child to get professional help. As I've said before, and it's obvious, doesn't need me to say it, if chas v'shalom, if we have a child who reports being abused, if that child is abused, we're obligated to immediately get that child the best help. The same way we respond if he was physically hit, if he was hit by a car, we'd rush him to the hospital. And if the child is fantasizing, then the child needs professional help anyway, and should be taken immediately to a professional. What makes anyone think, and I'm a rabbi, that rabbinic training could enable anyone to look at the child and determine whether he's telling the truth. How absurd. Now, I must admit that some of these realizations have taken me personally many years of struggle. I had the same predispositions I'm sure all the other Rabbanim have. I'm concerned about the image of my community. I sat on rabbinical court that dealt with an abuse case and discovered how little we were able to handle it. We had no investigators. We had no way of dealing with false witnesses. We had no tools. And we had to learn to understand our limitations and what we can do and what we can't do. And rabbis have a very important role. They should be supporting the family. They should be educating the community. They should do what rabbis are supposed to do. Let me just go on to one other area, because I don't want to take up too much time. And that is a phrase that is even more powerful than Masirah. It's a phrase called Chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name. And somehow we've gotten this perversion that if someone abuses a bunch of children and we keep it a secret, then there's no desecration of God's name because no one knows. But if someone reveals the crime, well, then it's going to make the media, and they're the ones guilty of desecrating God's name. How obviously absurd. Try applying it to anything else, right? If there would be a murderer in our midst, we're going to say, won't tell anybody, not desecration of God's name. No one knows we have a murderer. Well, he's killing a few people. But someone who goes to the police, that's desecrating God's name. Letting people know that this is a Jewish murderer. Just the other day, I'm sure that you're aware of District Attorney Hines' statement that in dealing with the parts of the Orthodox Jewish community, the code of silence, the shunning of the victims and their families is worse than the mafia. Now let's talk about Chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name, right? That the world sees us, that someone who has been working in this area, who works closely with our community, says that part of our community is worse than the mafia. That's desecrating God's name. Not that someone said it, but that unfortunately it seems to be true. Let me conclude by talking about community. I've spoken about rabbis, and people before have spoken about lawyers and prosecutors, but the key in many respects is our community. Because when all is said and done, when the victims, when their families, their supporters see themselves as outsiders, as people who are shunned by the mainstream of the community, they are devastated. And the situation won't get better. When it's the reverse, when the community supports people for going forward, when a parent of a child who's fighting for his child can walk into a minyan and daven anywhere and not feel that he can't even go into the shul, when all he wants to do is be a parent, caring for the welfare of his child. There's nothing more fundamental to be a parent. If I wanted to use my rabbinic license, in the Torah reading of yesterday, Moses finds a problem in the community he can't handle. And he says, Am I the parent? Did I give birth to these people? That I have to deal with the way they're behaving? His very question makes an obvious assumption that if he were their parent, he had given birth to them, then he'd have to do everything possible on their behalf, even if they were extremely difficult. That's the most fundamental parental responsibility. Parents have to protect their children, have to support their children, and the rest of us have to support the parents because we're parents as well. And we share in that. I encourage you, I ask of you, your rabbinic court has already taken the stand. It's whether the people in the community will follow appropriately. You have to pick sides. There's a statement that was made by a prominent psychologist who was one of the first to write about trauma and about abuse. And she wrote, about over 20 years ago, that the abuser and the victim both turn to the world around. There's one difference. All the abuser wants is that everybody stays silent. He doesn't need support. He just needs people not to do anything about it. The victim needs support. It's not good enough to say, I'm not part of the problem. Unless we're part of the solution, unless we're there for the victims, they're going to continue to suffer. Thank you.